I was 25 the summer I decided to camp alone in the mountains of Colorado. It was late July of 2014. The heat in town had been unbearable, and I wanted nothing more than to escape into the quiet of the high country. I'd been camping many times before, always with friends or family, but that trip was the first time I went completely by myself. I thought it would be peaceful, a way to clear my head. I drove my old silver Toyota up a dirt road that wound through thick pine forests. The higher I climbed, the cooler the air felt. The trees were tall and crowded together, the kind of woods that always seemed darker than they should, even during the day. I remember rolling down the window, breathing in the strong pine smell mixed with dust from the road. I found a small clearing next to a creek, far enough off the road that I wouldn't see anyone unless they came looking. It seemed perfect. There was a flat patch of ground for my tent, the water nearby for washing up, and plenty of firewood scattered around. I set up camp quickly, pitched the tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and stacked some dry branches for later. As the sun lowered behind the ridges, the air dropped fast. Nights in the mountains always felt colder than I expected. I built a fire, cooked a can of beans, and sat by the flames while the woods around me grew darker. The creek made a steady rushing sound that filled the silence, and now and then I could hear a bird or the snap of a branch deep in the trees. At first, I loved the quiet. It felt different being alone, almost cleaner, like nothing from the outside world could touch me. But after the fire burned down low, the quiet began to press on me in another way. The dark seemed heavier. Every sound felt sharper. A stick breaking in the woods made me sit up straight. The longer I stared into the dark, the more I felt like something was staring back. I finally crawled into my tent around 10. I zipped the flap shut, got into my sleeping bag, and tried to let the sound of the creek lull me to sleep. But my body wouldn't relax. My ears kept searching the night. I could hear the wind in the trees, small things moving in the brush, and once or twice the far-off call of what might have been a coyote. It was past midnight when I heard the first sound that froze me. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the creek. It was the crunch of footsteps on dry pine needles. Slow, heavy steps, too measured to be a deer. My heart started pounding so hard I thought it might give me away. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps came closer, circling, then stopping. I didn't move. I lay stiff in my sleeping bag, my hand gripping the small flashlight I'd kept by my side. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds, I couldn't tell. The sound faded, like whoever it was had moved back into the woods. I wanted to believe I'd imagined it, that maybe a tree branch had fallen or something, but deep down I knew. I stayed awake for hours, ears wide open, staring at the faint outline of the tent roof above me. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me into shallow sleep. I woke again to the sound of movement, but this time it wasn't footsteps. It was the faint metallic clink of something brushing against metal. My cooler. I had left it outside, latched shut beside the fire pit. I slowly unzipped the tent just a few inches, enough to peek out. The moon was bright enough to light the clearing. My cooler had been dragged several feet. The latch was open, and standing a short distance away was a man. He wasn't dressed like a hiker. He wore a dirty brown jacket even though the night wasn't freezing, and his pants looked ripped at the knees. He had a shaggy beard, and his hair was greasy, hanging down over his face. He was crouched low, rummaging through my food with his hands. My stomach turned cold. It wasn't just the fact that he was there. It was how quiet he was, how deliberate. He didn't stumble onto my camp by accident. He had been watching. I pulled the zipper back down, careful not to make a sound. My mind raced. I didn't have a gun, only a hatchet I'd used to chop firewood. My car was parked 20 yards away, but the keys were inside my backpack, sitting out near the fire pit. To get to them, I'd have to leave the tent. The man moved around my camp for what felt like forever. I could hear him opening bags, shifting through gear, breathing heavy. At one point, I heard the sound of fabric tearing, like he'd cut something open. My throat was dry, my palms sweating. Every nerve in my body screamed to do something, but I was frozen. I stayed curled inside the tent, barely daring to breathe. Eventually, the noises stopped. I waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The only sound was the creak again. When I finally unzipped the tent, the clearing looked empty. My cooler was tipped on its side, food scattered across the dirt. My backpack was gone. I didn't sleep after that. I sat up until dawn, gripping the hatchet with both hands, eyes fixed on the flap. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps. Every creak of the trees sounded like someone moving. When the first light touched the tops of the trees, I stuffed what little I had left into the car. My stomach was tight, my whole body shaky, but I kept moving. As I was packing, I noticed footprints in the soft dirt near the creek. Big boot prints, leading in and out of the trees. They weren't mine. They led deeper into the forest, in the opposite direction of the road. The drive down the mountain felt longer than the drive up. Every corner, every patch of woods, I expected to see that man step out. I didn't stop until I was back in town, surrounded by people, the noise of traffic filling the air. That night, I stayed in a cheap motel. I thought I'd sleep better with four walls around me, but I barely slept at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shape of that man crouched by my camp, his hands digging through my food like he owned it, like he'd been there waiting. I never went camping alone again. Even when I go with friends now, I find myself scanning the tree line every few minutes, listening too closely to every sound. I don't tell the story much because people always ask the same thing. Why didn't I get out? Why didn't I yell? Why didn't I fight back? The truth is, you don't know what you'll do until you're out there, cut off from everyone, realizing the only thing between you and a stranger in the woods is a thin sheet of nylon. And the part that still unsettles me most is this: he didn't take much, just some food and my backpack. He could have taken more. He could have taken everything. But he didn't. He left, which means he chose to. And that thought alone keeps me awake some nights, long after I've blown out the lantern and zipped the door shut. I was 24 when I took a long trip through Europe, and by late summer of 2018, I found myself in Austria. I had been bouncing from one city to another, staying mostly in cheap hostels, but after weeks of crowded dorm rooms and constant noise, I wanted some quiet. I had brought along a small tent and some basic camping gear, so I decided to camp for a few nights in the Austrian countryside, away from people and traffic. I picked a spot outside a small village not too far from Salzburg, near a stretch of woods that looked calm and untouched. The area was beautiful: rolling hills, scattered patches of forest, and small dirt trails that felt almost hidden. I hiked a good way in before finding a clearing where the grass was flat enough to pitch my tent. There was no official campground here. It was just land, quiet and open. I set up near the edge of the trees where I had some cover but could still see the night sky. My plan was to stay 2 nights before moving back toward civilization. The first day was peaceful. I walked around, cooked some simple food over a small camping stove, and sat back watching the sky darken over the hills. The evening air was cool, with the faint smell of pine drifting from the forest. It was exactly the break I wanted: no cars, no chatter, no rush, just silence. When the night settled in, I crawled into my sleeping bag inside the tent and let the sound of crickets carry me to sleep. But that night didn't stay quiet for long. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first I thought it was because of the cold, but then I heard something. It wasn't loud, just faint movement outside, like someone stepping carefully in the grass. My first thought was that it could be a deer or maybe some other animal passing by. I stayed completely still, listening. The sound would come for a few seconds, then stop, then start again, slow and steady. It wasn't heavy enough to sound like a large animal, but it also didn't feel random. It sounded like steps, human steps. I tried to calm myself, telling myself that it was just my head playing tricks, but the longer I listened, the more sure I became that someone was out there. I lay frozen inside my tent, staring at the fabric wall, every sense sharpened. The footsteps eventually faded, but by then my nerves were raw. I barely slept again, drifting in and out until the morning light finally came. When I stepped outside, the clearing looked the same as before. No sign of anyone. The ground was too grassy to show clear prints, and I tried to tell myself it had been nothing, maybe an animal after all. I shook it off, made some breakfast, and went for a walk along a dirt path leading deeper into the trees. That day passed quietly. I read a book I had carried with me, explored a bit of the forest, and took some photos. I didn't see anyone the entire day. By the time the sun started setting, I was calmer, telling myself I had just been spooked for no reason. But that night, it happened again. I woke up to the same faint sound, movement outside the tent. This time, I didn't just lie there. I slowly reached for the small flashlight I kept beside me and switched it on. The beam lit up the thin fabric of the tent walls, casting pale light in every direction. I listened hard. The footsteps stopped again, like whoever or whatever it was had frozen too. My chest tightened. I waited a few minutes, gripping the flashlight, my ears straining. The air felt heavier than before. When I couldn't take it anymore, I unzipped the tent flap just a little and shined the light outside. At first, I didn't see anything, just the trees and the empty clearing. I moved the beam slowly, my hand shaking slightly, until I caught something at the far edge of the clearing. A man was standing there. He was maybe 30 or 40 feet away, just at the edge where the clearing met the trees. He wasn't moving, just standing still, looking directly toward my tent. The flashlight caught his face for only a moment, but it was enough. He looked like an older man, maybe in his 50s, his hair thin and gray. His clothes were plain, a dark jacket, pants that looked a little too loose. His posture was stiff, his arms hanging by his sides. The instant my light hit him, I froze. For a long second, neither of us moved. Then, without a word, he turned slowly and walked back into the trees until he disappeared into the dark. I sat there in my tent for the rest of the night, not daring to move. Every sound made my skin crawl, and I couldn't close my eyes. I thought about packing up right then, but I didn't want to step out into the open where I had seen him. I waited until the sky started to lighten before I finally packed my gear as fast as I could. My hands shook while I tore down the tent, and I kept glancing at the tree line. The hike back toward the village felt like it took forever. My ears picked up every sound, every twig snapping, every rustle in the brush. I didn't see him again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The trails seemed more confusing than before, like I was moving too slow. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, steady and measured, but when I stopped and looked back, the woods were empty. When I finally reached the road that led back to the village, I felt a weight lift off me. Cars passed occasionally, and the sight of other people in the distance was almost overwhelming. I walked straight into the village, found a small guest house, and paid for a room without a second thought. Lying in that bed, surrounded by 4 solid walls, I thought back on what happened. There was no question about what I had seen. It wasn't a shadow, it wasn't an animal, it wasn't in my head. A man had been standing at the edge of my campsite, watching me in silence. Twice. He hadn't said anything, hadn't approached, but he had been there. I kept thinking about his face, the way he hadn't flinched when I pointed the light at him, the way he just turned and walked back into the dark like he belonged there. I didn't know if he was a local, maybe someone living off in those woods, or if he was something worse, someone who waited for campers to come out there alone. I'll never know, because I didn't stay another night to find out. After that, I stopped camping by myself for the rest of the trip. I stuck to hostels and cheap rooms, even if they were noisy. The quiet didn't seem so appealing anymore. It's been years since then, but I can still picture that clearing in Austria, the cold air against my face, and that man standing there just beyond the trees. Sometimes when I think about it, I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't turned the flashlight on. Would he have kept standing there, watching me until morning? Or would he have come closer, step by step, until I woke to the sound of him right outside my tent? I don't go camping alone anymore. I had decided to camp on my uncle's farm in Kansas during the late summer of 2011. I was 21 back then, old enough to not be afraid of the dark, but still curious enough to chase the kind of quiet that only farmland could give. The farm sat on the edge of a wide, flat plain that stretched for miles in every direction. Most of the land was cornfields broken up by a few patches of soybeans and scattered tree lines. There was a half-collapsed barn near the back of the property, and an old windmill that didn't spin anymore. My uncle hadn't lived there in years, but he kept the land, renting parts of it out and leaving the rest to sit in silence. The plan was simple. I'd drive out late in the afternoon, set up a tent near the far corner of the fields, and stay overnight alone. I wanted that heavy silence, the kind where every sound feels amplified and sharp. It wasn't about bravery or testing myself. I just wanted to be somewhere far from the constant noise of town. The air that day was hot and sticky, one of those late August days where the sky looks washed out and pale blue. Dust clung to the back of my throat as I drove down the long dirt road leading to the farm. The fields were tall and green, the corn stalks standing shoulder to shoulder like a wall. I parked near the tree line, loaded my gear on my back, and walked about half a mile toward a small clearing near the edge of a soybean field. The spot felt isolated but not claustrophobic, open enough that I could see the sky but tucked in just enough that the trees shielded me from the wind. I pitched the tent, laid out my sleeping bag, and set up a small fire ring with dry branches I gathered along the tree line. By the time the sun started to dip low, I had everything ready. The air changed as it got darker. The sound of insects thickened. A steady, high-pitched hum mixed with the low croak of frogs from somewhere farther out. The smell of dirt and cut grass hung heavy, and every so often the cornfield hissed as the wind pushed through the stalks. As night settled, I sat by the fire with a small flashlight and a thermos of water. The silence pressed harder now. Out in the country, away from everything, the kind of silence you get isn't empty. It's layered. You notice the smallest crack of a twig, the faint rustle of leaves. Every sound feels like it's directed at you. First, it was peaceful. I watched the flames eat through the sticks, sparks rising into the dark. The air cooled down and I pulled my jacket tighter. But then the noises started to feel different. I heard something moving in the corn. It wasn't the constant sway of the stalks in the wind. It was slower, heavier, like something was brushing through them carefully. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. I froze, holding the flashlight, trying to catch the shape of whatever it was. I told myself it was just a deer. The land was full of them, or maybe a raccoon nosing around. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized it didn't sound like an animal at all. It was steady, almost deliberate, the way the stalks parted. I turned the flashlight toward the field, sweeping the beam across the green wall of corn. The light bounced off the leaves, but I saw nothing. The sound stopped again. My pulse hammered in my ears. I let out a slow breath and tried to focus on the fire. After a few minutes, the noise didn't come back, and I told myself I was imagining it. Around midnight, I decided to crawl into the tent. The fire had burned low, just glowing coals now. I zipped up the flap, laid on my back, and tried to settle into the sleeping bag. The insects outside still droned, and the wind pushed softly through the trees. But then I heard it again. That same noise, stalks being brushed aside, one by one. This time it was closer, much closer. It wasn't random rustling. It was moving in a line, edging along the field, like someone was pacing just out of sight. My skin went cold. I held my breath and listened, counting the slow steps in my head. Then it stopped and everything went too quiet. The insects, the frogs, they all seemed to fade. The silence pressed so hard against the tent walls it felt like the air was holding its breath with me. I stayed still for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only minutes. My hand was tight around the flashlight, ready to switch it on, but I didn't want to move. I was convinced that if I made noise, whatever it was would hear me. Finally, exhaustion mixed with fear, and I must have drifted in and out of sleep. I woke to a soft crunch. Not in the field this time, on the dirt, just outside the tent. Slow steps pressing into the soil. I didn't move. My throat went dry, and every muscle in my body tensed. The steps circled once, then stopped at the back corner of the tent. I stared hard at the fabric, waiting for a shadow, a shape, anything. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it echo in my ears. Minutes crawled by. I didn't hear the steps leave. At some point, I must have passed out again, because the next thing I knew, gray light was seeping through the tent fabric. Dawn had come. When I unzipped the flap and stepped outside, the air was cool and damp with morning dew. The first thing I did was scan the dirt around the tent. That's when I saw them, prints, clear as day. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet. The dirt showed the outline of toes, the heel pressed deep, as if whoever it was had been walking slowly, carefully. The tracks circled the tent once, then led back into the cornfield. The fire was completely dead, just ash and blackened wood. My stomach twisted. The nearest house was almost 2 miles away, and nobody had any reason to be out there barefoot in the middle of the night. I packed everything up in a rush, stuffing the sleeping bag and tent without folding them properly. My hands shook as I shoved the gear into the trunk of the car. Driving back down the dirt road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the field watching me leave. I didn't stop until I was back on the main highway, the endless rows of corn shrinking in the distance. I never went back to camp on that farm again. I don't know who it was or why they were out there in the fields in the middle of the night with no shoes, circling my tent like that. Maybe they were watching me for hours. Maybe they were waiting for something. All I know is that someone was there, moving in the dark, close enough to touch the thin fabric that separated us. That's the part that stuck with me the most. Not knowing if they stood there while I slept, listening to me breathe, deciding what to do next. I had been planning that camping trip for weeks. It was late summer of 2012, and I wanted to get away from the noise of the city. I was 26 at the time, single and restless, and the idea of being alone in the woods sounded like the perfect reset. I drove out of Ohio down into West Virginia, aiming for the Monongahela National Forest. I had read that the forest was quieter than the big national parks and not as crowded. That's exactly what I was after. Quiet, no interruptions, just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind. The day I left was hot. The sun sat heavy in the sky, and the asphalt shimmered. My car was packed with a cheap 2-man tent, a sleeping bag, a cooler full of food and water, a folding chair, and my old hunting knife that I had owned since college. I wasn't going hunting, but carrying it gave me some peace of mind. I had also thrown in a flashlight, spare batteries, a small hatchet for firewood, and a first aid kit. Everything seemed in order. By the time I reached the forest, the sun was already dropping behind the ridges. The drive into the woods took longer than I expected because the gravel roads wound tightly, with steep drops to one side and dense pines on the other. The trees rose so tall that they blocked out most of the sky. The place felt older than anything I was used to. The deeper I went, the less I saw of people. The occasional truck pulled over on the side of the road was the only reminder I wasn't the only person out there. I eventually found a clearing about 100 yards off the gravel road. A faint trail led in, just wide enough to drag my gear through. The spot was flat, surrounded by thick brush on three sides, with a break in the trees that opened to a small stream. I set up camp there. The ground was soft with pine needles, and it smelled of damp earth. I pitched my tent, stacked wood for the fire, and cracked open a beer. The quiet was heavier than I expected. At first, it was peaceful, just crickets, the faint trickle of the stream, and the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind picked up. But once the sun went down, the silence felt different. Every sound carried sharper. A snapping twig in the distance felt close. The shadows between the trees looked thicker than they should. I lit the fire and cooked a couple of hot dogs on a stick. The flames danced, throwing light across the trees, but beyond the circle of fire, everything fell into blackness. I thought I heard movement once, something crunching slowly in the leaves. I froze and listened, but the sound stopped just as I noticed it. I told myself it was a deer. Around midnight, I crawled into the tent. I had left the fire burning low, just embers glowing red. I unrolled my sleeping bag and lay down. The nylon walls of the tent felt paper thin. I could hear every chirp, every groan of the trees. Sometime after lying there with my eyes closed, I heard it again. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, moving through the brush. Not the quick scurry of a raccoon or the heavy crash of a bear. Human-like. I held my breath, straining to listen. The steps stopped right outside the tent. I could hear the crunch of leaves, then nothing. My body went stiff. My hand moved slowly toward the knife I had kept beside me. I gripped it, heart pounding so hard I thought whoever was outside would hear it. Minutes passed. The silence stretched. I was too afraid to unzip the tent and look, so I just laid there, gripping the knife until my hand cramped. Eventually, I must have drifted into an uneasy sleep because I woke up to faint light filtering through the fabric. Morning brought some comfort. The forest didn't feel as threatening in daylight. I stepped outside, blinking at the sun, and checked the ground. I wasn't sure what I expected, but I did see impressions in the soft earth, not far from the tent. They weren't clear footprints, but the soil had been disturbed. Maybe it was my imagination, but it looked like someone had stood there. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was just being paranoid. The day went by quietly. I hiked along the stream, collected wood, and tried to relax. But in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the thought of those footsteps. By dusk, I felt uneasy again. I built the fire larger, trying to push the darkness back. The woods seemed to press closer as night fell. When I finally crawled into the tent again, I kept the knife closer and left the flashlight in my hand. The forest outside was alive with chirps and snaps. I tried to tell myself it was normal, that the woods always sounded like this. But then, just like the night before, I heard slow steps again, leaves crunching, branches pushing aside. This time, it didn't stop outside the tent. It circled. I could hear it moving around me, one careful step at a time. My chest tightened, and I held the knife so tight my knuckles hurt. Then I heard the sound of something brushing against the tent fabric. A finger? A hand? The thin nylon shifted slightly, like something traced along it. I wanted to shout, to scare whoever it was away, but fear pinned me in place. After what felt like an hour, the steps faded into the distance. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I had made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed up as fast as I could, shoving my gear into the car without caring how it fit. As I was rolling up the tent, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the dirt, right where I had heard the brushing sound, was a footprint, clear as day, barefoot, human, driving out of the forest. I kept checking my rearview mirror. The woods looked normal in the morning light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, maybe even following me. When I finally hit the main highway, I pulled over at a gas station. My hands were still shaking. That was the last time I camped alone. I never reported it because I had no proof, and I figured no one would believe me anyway. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. There had been someone out there in those woods, moving around my camp, watching me in the dark. Maybe just some drifter, maybe someone worse. I'll never know. But every time I think about camping again, I remember standing there in the daylight, looking at that barefoot print in the soil. It reminded me that the forest wasn't empty like I wanted it to be. Someone had been there, just feet from where I slept, waiting in the dark. And the worst part is, I'll never know why. I was 29 when I drove out to the northern woods of Michigan in late October of 2004. The air had that sharp edge of fall, the kind that cut across your face when you stepped out of the truck. I had hunted before, but never this deep into the forest and never fully alone. I told myself it would just be a couple of nights, 3 at most. I wanted the peace, the silence, the challenge. The dirt road leading in had been narrow, overgrown on both sides, with branches tapping against the truck as I crawled down it. I stopped at a small clearing near the end of the track where the forest swallowed everything else. From there, it was just me, my pack, my rifle, and the cold. I set camp near a tree line where the woods bent down into a marshy stretch. It looked like a good place to catch deer crossing at dusk. I kept it simple. One small tent, a rolled-out sleeping bag, a fire pit dug into the ground. The woods were quiet except for a crow that circled overhead, its calls echoing far off. That first day went smoothly. I scouted a trail about half a mile from camp, spotted some fresh tracks in the soft dirt, and felt a rush of excitement. The sun slid down early that time of year, and by the time I got back to camp, the sky had turned a heavy gray. I built a small fire, cooked up a can of beans, and sat listening to the stillness settle. The kind of stillness where every snap of a twig sounds louder than it should. When night fully came, the dark was thick, pressing against the walls of the tent. The only light was the faint glow of the fire dying down outside. I lay in my bag, staring at the nylon above me, hearing the small pops and cracks of branches shifting in the cold. At one point, I heard something heavier move through the brush. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon, maybe nothing at all. Sleep eventually pulled me under. The next morning, I was up before sunrise. The air damp and bitter cold. Frost crusted the grass. My breath rose in white clouds as I headed toward the trail with my rifle slung over my shoulder. The woods were darker than I expected. Even after the sun broke the horizon, the trees blocked most of the light, keeping everything dim. I tracked for hours, spotting prints, pausing to listen, but never catching sight of anything bigger than a squirrel. At one point, I realized I had walked farther than planned. My camp was nowhere in sight, and the silence around me had grown heavier. No wind, no birds, just the sound of my boots crunching leaves. That's when I noticed the other prints. They weren't deer. They weren't boots like mine either. They looked like worn shoes, edges uneven, dragging slightly as if whoever made them was limping. They crossed the same deer trail I'd been following. My chest tightened. This wasn't supposed to be a place people wandered into. The closest house had to be 10 miles away. I stood there, staring down at those faint tracks in the mud, debating whether to follow them or turn back. I told myself it was nothing, probably an old hunter's trail from weeks ago. Still, the edges of those prints looked fresh, not dried out. The rest of the day passed in a blur of nerves. I didn't see a single deer. Every time the wind shifted, I felt watched. By mid-afternoon, I made my way back toward camp, stopping often to glance behind me. Nothing moved. Nothing sounded. When I reached camp, the fire pit looked disturbed. Not a lot, just a little. Ash scattered like someone had stepped too close. I told myself it could have been the wind, though the air had been still all day. My stomach felt knotted, but I forced myself to get the fire going again and cooked some jerky. As the light drained, the forest grew darker faster than the night before. That night, lying in the tent, I couldn't sleep. The silence outside was broken once by what sounded like careful steps on dry leaves. Slow, paused, then gone. My ears strained, my body frozen, my hand on the rifle beside me. I waited like that for what felt like hours. At some point, exhaustion pulled me under again. I woke at dawn to find the edge of the tent smeared with mud. A handprint, small, too small to be mine. Not a child's, but narrow, wiry. My heart pounded as I knelt there staring at it. The damp brown smudge where someone had touched the tent during the night. Every instinct told me to pack up and leave right then. But part of me was stubborn. I had driven all the way out here. I had told myself I'd stay at least 2 nights. So I convinced myself again that it was nothing. Maybe I brushed it without realizing. Maybe I'd panicked over nothing. I went out again that morning, hunting half-heartedly. But my mind was back at camp the whole time. Every sound in the woods felt sharper, closer. By midday, I gave up and turned back. When I reached the clearing, I stopped dead. My pack was open. Not ripped, not dumped, but opened. Zippers halfway undone. Some food missing. My knife lay on the ground a few feet from where I had left it. Whoever had been here had gone through my things, taken only what they wanted, and left the rest. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. My chest felt hollow. My skin prickled as I shoved everything back into the bag. The fire pit was still cold from the night before. I didn't bother relighting it. I broke down the tent as fast as my hands could move. Every sound behind me felt like a footstep. Every shift of leaves a breath too close. When I finally had everything thrown into the truck bed, I jumped into the cab and slammed the locks down. My hands shook on the steering wheel as I started the engine. The dirt road out seemed longer than before, the trees pressing in on both sides like walls. Halfway down that track, I caught sight of something in the rearview mirror. Just a flash, a figure stepping out from the tree lean into the clearing I had just left. Thin, hunched, watching. I didn't slow down. I didn't look again. I drove until the dirt turned to gravel, gravel to pavement, and only when I hit the highway did my breath finally even out. I never went back to that place. Even now, years later, I can remember the shape of that handprint on the tent, the neat way my pack had been unzipped. Whoever was out there wasn't lost, wasn't desperate. They were patient, they were watching, and they wanted me to know it. That's what made me leave. Not the thought of being attacked, but the thought of someone silently circling me, studying me, waiting for the moment I stayed too long. I was 21 the summer I decided to take a solo camping trip in northern Minnesota. It was 2014, and I had just finished my second year of college. I had always liked the idea of being alone in the woods for a while, testing myself without the noise of people around me. I packed light but careful, tent, sleeping bag, small propane stove, some food, a hatchet, a hunting knife, and a basic first aid kit. I drove 6 hours from my apartment to a state forest that wasn't as popular as the others. Fewer families, fewer fishermen, fewer campers in general. That was part of the appeal. I parked my car at a gravel pull-off where the dirt road ended. From there, I had to hike 3 miles along a barely marked trail that led into thick pine and birch. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Even the sound of the wind seemed softer under the tall trees. By the time I reached the clearing I had marked on my map, my shoulders were aching from the pack, but I felt good. The clearing was small, only about 30 feet across, with moss-covered rocks and a soft bed of pine needles. A stream ran close enough that I could hear the water trickling. Felt like the perfect spot. I set up camp quickly. The tent went up at the edge of the clearing, facing the stream. I laid out my sleeping bag, gathered some dead branches, and built a small fire pit with stones. As the sun lowered, I boiled water on the propane stove and ate a freeze-dried meal. The night came fast and heavy. With no streetlights or houses anywhere, the darkness pressed in like a wall. I sat by the small fire until the wood burned low, listening to the forest noises, crickets, frogs, the occasional splash from the stream. I remember feeling both at peace and uneasy at the same time, like the woods were too big and I was too small. The first night was fine. I woke up a couple times to adjust in the sleeping bag, but I didn't hear anything unusual. The second day, I hiked further along the stream, explored a ridge that gave me a wide view of the forest, and collected more firewood. The air smelled sharp, like pine sap and damp earth. When I came back to camp in the afternoon, I noticed something small but strange. A stick, one I had left leaning against the tent, was on the ground a few feet away. I figured I must have knocked it over myself or the wind had shifted it. I didn't think much of it. That night, though, was different. I was lying in my tent after the fire had gone out, staring into the dark fabric above me, when I heard something, soft footsteps, maybe 30 feet away. It wasn't an animal running, not the quick rustle of a deer or the light scurry of a raccoon. It was slow, measured, almost like someone walking. My stomach tightened. I held my breath and listened. The sound stopped. I told myself it could have been a branch falling, or maybe a porcupine dragging itself across the ground. Eventually, I fell asleep, though it was restless and shallow. The next morning, I checked around camp. Nothing was disturbed, no tracks I could see in the soil, but I couldn't shake the sound from my head. I carried my hatchet with me all day as I walked. The thought of someone else being out there crept into me. I hadn't seen another person since leaving the car. There weren't any cabins or hunting shacks marked on the map. Still, the forest was huge. People could be anywhere. That evening, as the sun sank behind the trees, I was cooking noodles on the stove when I noticed something else. Across the stream, on the opposite bank about 40 yards away, a tree had fresh cuts in the bark. Clean cuts, like from a knife or hatchet, strips of pale wood showing. They hadn't been there the day before. My mouth went dry. Someone had been there, close enough to see my camp, close enough to leave marks. I stared at those cuts for a long time before turning back to my stove. That night, I didn't sleep much at all. Every sound seemed louder, the snapping of branches, the wind pushing through the trees. At some point, I heard it again. The slow crunch of footsteps, closer this time, maybe just beyond the clearing. I lay frozen, gripping my hunting knife in the dark. My heartbeat was so loud it filled my ears. The steps stopped, then silence. I waited, eyes wide open, until I eventually drifted into a light, anxious sleep. The fourth morning, I woke up groggy and sore. My first thought was leaving. The trip had been meant for 5 nights, but the idea of staying any longer twisted my stomach. As I stepped out of the tent, my foot hit something. It was a small pile of stones, stacked neatly right by the flap of the tent. 5 stones, balanced on top of each other. They hadn't been there when I went to sleep. My skin went cold. Someone had walked into my camp while I slept, close enough to touch my tent, and left that there. I didn't eat breakfast. I packed as quickly as I could, shoving everything into my bag without caring how it fit. The woods felt too quiet, like everything was holding its breath. As I shouldered my pack and started back toward the trail, I kept glancing behind me. The feeling of being watched didn't leave. Every few minutes I thought I saw movement in the trees, but when I focused, it was gone. The hike back felt twice as long. My legs burned, but I didn't slow down. When I finally saw the dirt road where I had parked, relief rushed through me. But then I noticed something that almost made me drop my pack. My car was there, but the driver's side door was slightly open. I knew I had locked it. My throat tightened as I walked closer, gripping the hatchet in one hand. The inside of the car smelled faintly of cigarettes, though I didn't smoke. On the passenger seat, my map had been unfolded and spread out, a circle drawn in pen around the clearing where I had camped. I didn't wait. I threw my pack into the back, slammed the doors shut, and drove off fast, gravel spitting under the tires. The whole drive home, I kept checking the mirror, half expecting headlights to appear behind me. They never did. When I got back to my apartment, I checked every lock twice and barely slept for 2 nights. I never went back to that forest. Even now, years later, I think about it. Not the quiet stream or the smell of pine, but the footsteps in the dark, the stacked stones, the cuts in the tree, the open car door. Somebody had been out there with me, watching, moving closer each night. And the worst part is not knowing what they wanted or how long they had been following me before I even noticed. I was 23 in the summer of 2012 when I decided to take a trip out to the desert in northern New Mexico. I had been doing weekend camping trips for years, usually in the forests closer to home in Colorado, but I wanted something different. A friend had told me about a stretch of land near the Navajo Nation where you could set up a camp far from anyone. Nothing but dry plains, red rock formations, and scattered juniper trees. I had an old Toyota Tacoma with a camper shell on the back and a decent amount of gear, so I figured I'd be fine on my own for a few nights. The drive itself felt endless. The 2-lane highways narrowed into rough dirt roads, and the further I went, the fewer signs of people I saw. No gas stations, no farmhouses, no traffic. Just sun, wind, and sand. By the time I found a spot to park and hike out, the late afternoon light had already started to fade into that deep orange that deserts seem to hold on to forever. I carried my pack out maybe a mile from the truck, far enough to feel isolated but close enough that I could return if the weather turned. The first night was calm. I built a small fire, cooked a can of beans, and sat staring up at the stars. The sky out there looked unreal, every inch dotted with white light. I remember feeling small in a good way, like I was out where humans didn't matter anymore. The silence was deep, only broken by the occasional rustle of the dry brush when the wind picked up. Eventually, I crawled into my tent and slept. It was the second night when things shifted. I had spent most of the day walking the ridges, exploring shallow arroyos, and just trying to soak up the emptiness. I found strange claw marks on some of the rocks, but I told myself it was just from mountain lions or coyotes. When the sun began to dip, I returned to my camp, sore and dusty. I made a small fire again, but the wind was stronger that night, blowing hard enough that sparks carried further than I liked. I let the flames die down and sat in the dark with only the glow of the coals. That was when I started to feel it, the sense that something was out there. It wasn't a sound at first. It was just a weight, like the way your gut tightens before a storm hits. My eyes kept darting to the tree line. The junipers stood there, twisted and low, but in the half-light they looked like crouched figures. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, uneven, crunching in the dry soil. At first I thought it was a deer or maybe a stray cow, but the steps were too deliberate. They would come a few paces closer, then stop like whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be noticed. I sat frozen, gripping my small camping knife, staring into the dark. Minutes passed. The sound stopped. The silence pressed down so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat. I finally forced myself into the tent, zipped it tight, and lay with the knife in my hand. Sleep didn't come easy. Every little scrape of wind against the fabric sounded like fingers. Sometime after midnight, I woke to the sound of breathing outside the tent. Not an animal snort or huff, human breathing. Shallow, slow, as if someone was crouched inches from me, listening. I didn't move. I barely even let myself blink. My chest hurt from holding my breath. Stayed there for what felt like forever. Then slowly, very slowly, the sound faded away. By morning, I convinced myself it had to have been the wind or my imagination. But when I stepped out of the tent, I saw the tracks. Bare feet, pressed deep into the sand and circling my camp. No shoes, no boots. Just bare human footprints, wider than mine and longer too. My stomach dropped. I packed my bag right then and there, ready to head back to the truck. But curiosity, or maybe stubbornness, made me stay one more night. I told myself I'd be fine if I built the fire bigger, kept my knife close, and didn't let paranoia get to me. That day, I stuck closer to camp, watching the landscape, listening for anything. Nothing came. The desert was still and empty. When darkness came, I set the fire high and sat with my back to the tent so I could see in every direction. Hours passed. Then, just after midnight, I saw movement near the ridge. A figure, tall and thin, walking on two legs. It stopped in the open, just outside the circle of firelight. I couldn't make out a face, only the outline of a body that looked wrong. The arms were too long, the posture slightly hunched, like it wasn't built to walk upright but was forcing itself to. I gripped the knife and stayed still. The figure just stood there, watching me. I don't know how long, maybe 10 minutes, maybe more. My mouth was dry, and my hands were shaking so bad I thought I'd drop the blade. Finally, it turned. It didn't walk away like a person would. It loped, half running, half stumbling, disappearing into the dark without a sound. I didn't sleep at all that night. At the first hint of dawn, I grabbed my gear and practically ran back to the truck. The footprints were there again, circling the camp. Bare feet, some pressed deep like someone had been crouching low. When I got to the truck, I slammed the doors and locked them. Even though I was in the middle of nowhere, driving out, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure trailing me down the dirt road. My hands didn't stop shaking until I hit the highway hours later. I never went back to that spot. In fact, I stopped camping alone for years after that. I've told myself over and over it had to have been some drifter living out in the desert, someone messed up in the head, maybe trying to scare me off. But in the back of my mind, I know what I saw. The way it moved wasn't right, the way it watched me wasn't normal. I think about those bare footprints sometimes. Too big, too human, and too wrong to just be some stranger. Whatever it was out there, it wanted me to know I wasn't alone. And I've never forgotten that. I still remember that camping trip with my boss, Richard, back in the summer of 2014. At the time, I was 27, working in a construction supply company in northern Minnesota. Richard wasn't the kind of boss who liked sitting behind a desk all the time. He hunted, fished, camped, and every now and then he invited one of us from work to go along. That summer, it was me. I didn't want to say no, even though the idea of being alone with him in the woods for 3 nights made me uneasy. He was strict at work, and I figured spending days around him out in the open could get tense. Still, I thought it might help my standing at the job. We drove out in his truck, leaving early Friday morning. The plan was simple. 2 nights in the Chippewa National Forest, deep enough in that there wouldn't be anyone else around. He wanted to camp away from the main sites, so he parked the truck along a service road, and we hiked in with our packs. The air was hot, the kind of humid heat that clings to your clothes and makes every breath heavy. The The forest was thick with pine and birch. Every step sank slightly into the damp ground, soft from weeks of summer rain. Bugs clung to the air, buzzing around my ears, sticking to my arms. By the time we found a flat patch of ground near a small lake, I was drenched in sweat. Richard moved fast, setting up his tent in minutes, his motions sharp and practiced. Mine took longer, and I felt his eyes on me, watching, as if judging every little mistake I made. The first night seemed normal enough. We cooked over a small fire, a mix of sausages and beans he'd packed, the grease sizzling on the pan. As the sun went down, the tree line turned into a black wall, and the forest changed. The air grew still, heavy, and every sound seemed louder than it should have been. A branch snapping echoed like a crack. A splash on the lake carried far across the water. I lay in my tent later that night, staring at the nylon roof just a few inches from my face, sweating in the warm air, listening to the forest groan and shift. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps, slow, steady, crunching over the damp ground. At first, I thought it was Richard getting up to piss, but the steps didn't head away. They circled. I held my breath, listening. The steps moved just outside my tent, then faded, then came back again. My chest tightened. I reached for the knife I'd kept in my pack, pulling it close. Eventually, the steps faded into the trees. I told myself it had to be Richard, or maybe a deer wandering close. Still, it took me hours to fall back asleep. The next morning, Richard acted like nothing was wrong. He didn't mention getting up in the night, and I didn't ask. He wanted to hike out further to scout for a better spot to fish. The sun was brutal that day, baking the dirt trails, and my shirt stuck to my back. We carried water and a small cooler, walking miles along narrow trails that wound around the lake. The silence between us grew heavier with each step. He didn't talk much, and I didn't want to risk saying something dumb. By late afternoon, we returned to camp, our legs aching. Richard checked his gear, cleaned his rifle, and set up some fishing lines. I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the memory of those footsteps. That evening, when the fire burned low, I kept glancing into the trees. Sometimes, I swore I saw a figure standing between the trunks, but when I blinked, it was gone. That night, the noises returned. I woke again to footsteps, closer this time, slower. My body froze, every muscle tense. I could hear the crunch of leaves, then the faint sound of breathing. Not an animal, steady, human breathing. It lingered for minutes, then drifted away. I lay awake until dawn, my eyes burning, my body stiff. When morning came, I noticed something strange. Around the edge of the camp, pressed faintly into the dirt, were footprints. Not boots like Richard's, not shoes like mine. Bare feet. The ground was soft enough to catch the outline of toes. I crouched low, staring at them, my stomach turning. Richard didn't notice, or if he did, he didn't say anything. The third day, things grew worse. The heat hadn't let up, and the air was thick, heavy with the smell of damp soil and pine sap. I felt drained, every step sluggish. Richard wanted to push deeper into the woods to hunt small game, so I followed, my eyes scanning every shadow. We didn't see much, just squirrels and the occasional bird, but the feeling of being watched never left me. I kept turning around, sure I'd catch someone behind us, but the trail was always empty. By late afternoon, a storm rolled in. Dark clouds swallowed the sky, and thunder cracked over the lake. We rushed back to camp as the rain poured, soaking everything. Water dripped into my tent, pooling near my feet. I lay there, damp and restless, listening to the storm die down. When night fell, I was already on edge. I held my knife in my hand, resting against my chest. Hours passed. The forest was silent after the rain, too silent. Then, just like before, the steps came. slow, circling, stopping just outside my tent. My breath caught in my throat. The steps lingered, pacing around. I gripped the knife so hard my knuckles ached. I waited for Richard to react, to say something, but his tent stayed quiet. Suddenly, a shadow fell across the thin nylon of my tent, a human shape standing still. I felt my skin crawl. The figure stayed there for what felt like forever, then moved away into the trees. I could still hear the faint crunch of footsteps, fading, then returning again, like whoever it was didn't want to leave. By morning, I'd had enough. I stepped outside, my eyes bloodshot, my clothes damp and sticky. The camp looked normal, but the footprints were back. Fresh, circling the tents, bare feet pressing deep into the mud. I looked at Richard. He stood by the fire, poking at the ashes, acting as if nothing had happened. We didn't stay the third night. I told him I wasn't feeling well, that I needed to head back. He didn't argue. We packed fast, shouldered our gear, and hiked out. The walk back to the truck felt endless, every rustle in the trees making my heart pound. When we finally reached the service road, I felt a weight lift off me. The forest was still behind us, the air heavy and damp, but the sight of that dusty road gave me relief. We loaded the truck in silence and drove off, neither of us mentioning the nights we'd spent there. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. I know it wasn't Richard. He never left his tent when I was awake, and his boots couldn't have made those prints. Whoever it was, they were watching us. Not once, not twice, but every single night. I've camped since then, but never that deep, never that far away from people. Every time I step into the woods now, I think about those bare footprints circling in the mud, and the shadow outside my tent, standing still in the silence. That trip taught me something I'll never forget. The woods can hide more than animals, and sometimes the scariest thing out there is another person. I was 24 when I decided to take a short trip out to the woods in northern Montana. It was the summer of 2016, and I had just quit a job that had been draining me for months. I wanted space, quiet, and the kind of solitude that only comes when you're away from paved roads and buzzing cell towers. I had a small 2-person tent, a sleeping bag, a pack full of food, and enough stubbornness to convince myself I could handle being out there alone for a few nights. I drove out past a small town called Libby, following a dirt road that twisted deeper into the forest. The further I went, the more the air smelled of pine and wet earth, and the less I thought about the noise of everyday life. By the time I pulled off to a clearing near a creek, the sun was already sinking low behind the tall ridges. The place felt perfect, quiet but not too isolated. The sound of running water was steady in the background, and there was just enough flat ground to set up camp. That first night, nothing felt out of place. I cooked a small meal on my camp stove, listened to the water, and watched the stars appear one by one until the sky was heavy with them. The forest creaked and shifted the way forests do, but it didn't bother me. I slept easily, wrapped in my bag, the smell of pine needles thick inside the tent. The second day I hiked. I followed the creek for a while, then cut off onto a small trail that seemed less used. It led uphill, weaving through old trees and sharp rocks. Every now and then I'd stop just to listen. The silence out there was deep. No distant highways, no planes overhead, nothing but wind and the occasional crack of a branch. I stayed out until the afternoon before heading back to camp. I was tired, sweaty, and glad for the cold water of the creek to wash my face in. It was that night things started to feel different. I was sitting by the fire I'd built, poking at the wood with a stick, when I noticed something across the creek. The firelight didn't reach that far, but I thought I saw movement, a shape against the darker trees. I stared for a long time, squinting, waiting for it to move again, but the shadows stayed still. I told myself it was my eyes playing tricks and turned back to the fire. Still, when I finally crawled into my tent, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, standing just past where I could see. The forest was alive with its usual noises: crickets, the gurgle of the creek, the wind pressing against branches. But I lay awake, staring at the nylon above me, hearing every crack of a stick like it was right outside. I must have drifted off eventually, because I woke to morning light pouring in and the sound of birds overhead. The third day, I tried to brush it off. I went fishing in the creek, caught nothing, and walked up the ridge behind camp just to get my body moving. The whole time, though, I felt like I was being followed. It wasn't that I heard footsteps. It was more like the silence behind me had weight, as if someone was always just a few paces out of sight. I'd turn, scan the trees, wait, and then move on again. By late afternoon, I was restless. I gathered more wood for the fire and sat by it long before the sun went down. I didn't want to be sitting in the dark by myself again. The woods looked different at dusk. The trees seemed closer, the spaces between them narrower, and the shadows stretched long and thin. I kept my knife close that night, just sitting with it across my lap while the fire burned low. At one point, I heard something move across the creek again. This time, it wasn't a trick of the eye. Something shifted, heavy, a weight breaking through underbrush. I froze, staring hard, waiting. The fire popped, and in that instant, I thought I saw the outline of a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, standing just far enough that I couldn't see his face. My stomach dropped. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I just sat there gripping the knife until my hand hurt. The figure stayed still for what felt like minutes, then turned and slipped back into the trees. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't hear anything at all. That night, I didn't sleep much. Every sound outside my tent made me sit up, clutching the knife. Once, I swore I heard soft crunching footsteps circling the tent, slow, deliberate. I held my breath until the sound faded. When dawn came, I was exhausted, my whole body tense. I thought about leaving right then, packing up and driving out, but some part of me wanted to believe I was imagining it. Maybe it was another camper out there, maybe a hunter passing through. I told myself that and tried to calm down. The fourth night made it clear I wasn't imagining. I had built the fire higher than usual, letting it burn strong as the sky darkened. The sound of the creek no longer felt peaceful. It felt like it was covering footsteps, masking movements I couldn't hear. I sat with my back against a log, watching the woods across from me. My skin prickled like it knew something was watching. And then I saw him. He stepped into the faint light across the creek. This time, there was no mistaking it. He was a man taller than me, wearing clothes too dark to make out details. His face was shadowed, but I could tell he was looking straight at me. He didn't move. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, watching. My chest felt like it was closing in. I wanted to shout, to do something, but fear held me down. I just stared back. The fire crackled and spit sparks into the air. And in that flickering light, I realized something worse. He wasn't just standing there randomly. He was holding something. It looked like an axe or a long-handled tool, gripped in one hand at his side. I don't know how long we stayed like that. Eventually, he turned, slow and easy, and disappeared into the trees again. That was enough. I didn't wait for morning. I grabbed my pack, stuffed what I could into it, and tore down my tent half-collapsed, leaving behind what I couldn't carry. My heart pounded so loud I couldn't hear the creek anymore. I kept the knife in my hand as I hiked back toward the dirt road where my car was parked. Every step, I felt like he was behind me. I didn't hear him, but I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting him to be right there, silent, watching. The woods felt endless. Branches snapped somewhere off the trail more than once, but I didn't stop to see. I just kept moving, legs burning, lungs tight. When I finally reached my car, the relief almost made me drop to my knees. I threw my gear in the back, slammed the door, and sped down that dirt road faster than I should have. I didn't stop until I was back in town, parked under the yellow lights of a gas station, breathing like I'd run miles. I never went back for the rest of my gear. The tent, the stove, the little things I'd left behind, they're still out there, maybe. But I wasn't about to return. Even now, years later, I think about that man sometimes. I wonder if he was following me from the first night, if he was watching while I slept, if he'd planned to do something worse before I left. The silence of the woods used to be something I loved. Now, whenever I go hiking, I can't hear silence without thinking of that figure across the creek, standing still with an axe in his hand, waiting for the firelight to burn low. I had been saving for a trip through Europe for over a year, and by the summer of 2017, I finally had enough money to take a few weeks off and travel. I wasn't looking for city lights or crowded places. I wanted to disappear into quiet landscapes, away from busy streets and loud voices. Austria ended up being on my list because of its lakes, mountains, and forests that stretched for miles without another soul in sight. By late June, I was in the region of Styria, not far from the Hochschwab Mountains. I had rented a small car from Vienna and drove through narrow roads lined with tall pine trees and patches of farmland. The roads curved and climbed, then dipped back into valleys, and the farther I went, the fewer houses I saw. Most of the tourists stayed near the main villages, but I wanted a spot far from people. I carried a tent, a sleeping bag, some food, a small camping stove, and a flashlight. I parked the car near a small pull-off beside the road and carried my gear deeper into the woods. It was late afternoon, but the light stretched long because of the season. The forest air felt damp, filled with the smell of moss and resin. The only sounds came from birds and the occasional stream running downhill. After about 40 minutes of hiking, I found a small clearing not too far from a brook. The ground was flat, soft with pine needles, and it seemed perfect for setting up camp. I pitched my tent, set down my pack, and gathered some firewood. It was quiet in a way that almost pressed on my ears, but it was exactly what I had wanted. I cooked some pasta on the little stove, ate slowly, and then sat against a log while the light faded behind the trees. The forest became darker shade by shade, and soon I could barely make out the outlines of the branches above me. When night fell, the forest felt like it had swallowed everything. The stars were bright but small between the gaps in the trees. I went into the tent, zipped it up, and laid down. For a while, I just listened. The sound of water from the brook was steady, broken sometimes by the crack of branches from somewhere farther away. I told myself it was just deer moving. I shifted in the sleeping bag and forced my eyes shut. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke again. It was still dark. My watch showed a little after 2 in the morning. At first, I didn't know what had pulled me out of sleep. Then I realized I had heard something outside the tent. Not a branch falling, not the distant trickle of the brook. Something else. It was soft footsteps moving slowly across the clearing. I froze, every muscle in my body tight. The steps weren't heavy, but they weren't the quick and scattered sound of an animal. They were steady, deliberate, one after the other. They moved across the clearing, then paused. My tent was thin. If I looked sideways, I could make out the faint outline of trees against the sky. And then, for a second, I saw another outline, a figure standing. Still, I held my breath. My heart was thudding so hard I was sure it could be heard. The figure didn't move. I couldn't make out details, just the unmistakable shape of a person standing a few feet from my tent. I thought maybe it was a hiker, someone who had gotten lost. But who hikes at 2 in the morning in deep woods with no light? I kept waiting, listening for something, anything. The figure shifted, and I heard the crunch of pine needles. The steps circled the tent slowly, deliberate, as if the person was inspecting it. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I kept my hands tight around the sleeping bag. The steps stopped again, and for a long stretch of minutes, there was nothing but silence. I wanted to reach for my flashlight, but I knew the sound of the zipper on the bag would give me away. Eventually, the steps started again, this time moving away. I waited until I couldn't hear them anymore, then kept waiting. 10 minutes, 20. I didn't move, just lay frozen in the bag until my chest ached from staying still. I must have drifted in and out of a shallow, nervous sleep because the next time I opened my eyes, faint morning light was pushing through the thin fabric of the tent. When I finally unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the air was cold and damp. The clearing looked the same as before, except for something that made my stomach turn. Around the tent, in the soft pine needles, were footprints. Not boots like mine, lighter, flatter, like worn shoes. They circled the tent in a full loop, then led back toward the trees. I followed them a short distance, but they disappeared once the ground became rocky. I told myself it was probably a hunter or maybe a villager passing through, though none of it made sense. Why come that close to a stranger's tent in the middle of the night? Why walk in circles and then vanish? I decided to pack up and leave. My hands shook as I rolled the tent and stuffed it into my pack. The forest didn't feel peaceful anymore. Every sound of snapping branches made me flinch. Every shadow between the trees seemed to stretch too long. I followed the brook back toward the road, moving faster than I usually hiked. When I reached the car, I felt a wave of relief. The road was empty, and the village was still several kilometers away, but at least the woods weren't closing in on me anymore. I loaded everything in, started the engine, and drove. On the way back, I stopped at a gas station near a small town. I went inside to buy water and some bread. My reflection in the glass doors looked pale, my eyes red from lack of sleep. When I paid at the counter, I noticed a local notice board near the entrance. Old flyers, faded papers. One caught my eye because of the photograph, grainy, black and white, but still clear enough to make me freeze. It showed the face of a man, sharp cheekbones, hollow eyes, thin hair. The text underneath was in German, but I understood enough of it to know it was about a missing person. The date was from years earlier. The man in the picture looked eerily like the silhouette I had seen outside my tent. Same build, same narrow face. My stomach dropped. I didn't stop to read the rest of the flyer. I walked straight out, got into the car, and kept driving until I reached a larger town with more people, more light, more noise. I didn't camp alone again in Austria. For the rest of the trip, I stuck to hostels, small inns, and crowded campsites. The quiet woods I had once wanted felt different after that night. Even now, years later, I remember lying still in that thin tent, listening to the sound of slow steps circling me, the weight of someone watching. The memory of those footprints pressed into the pine needles is sharper than any photograph I could have taken. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a story someone else told me. It was a man, real and breathing, out there in the forest with me in the middle of the night. And what unsettles me most is that I'll never know why. I was 23 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in New Mexico, back in the fall of 2011. I had just finished a long stretch of work and needed to get away from everything. I chose a remote spot near the Carson National Forest, a place I had read about online where people rarely camped. I liked that idea. I wanted the silence, the emptiness, the break from traffic and phones and constant noise. I drove up a rough dirt road until my little car couldn't go any farther. From there, I strapped on my backpack, loaded with a tent, sleeping bag, food, and a small camping stove and started hiking. The air was dry, and every step sent up a little puff of dust from the trail. I could smell the faint sweetness of pine needles baking in the sun. The forest was quiet except for the sound of wind moving through the trees and the occasional chirp of birds that cut out the moment I got too close. After about 2 hours, I found a flat patch of ground tucked between some trees with a little clearing nearby. I set up camp there. Felt right. No other tents, no trash, no signs of people. Just me and the woods. The first night passed quietly. I cooked a small meal, sat by a tiny fire until the stars came out, and crawled into my sleeping bag when the chill settled in. The silence was heavy, almost pressing, but I got used to it. I slept fine, with only the sound of wind rattling branches above me. The second night was different. I had hiked most of the day, exploring some narrow trails that led up into higher ridges. By the time I got back, the sun was dipping low, and shadows stretched long through the trees. I made dinner quickly, ate, and sat by the fire. I remember looking up and thinking how clear the stars were, so sharp against the dark sky. Then I heard something. It started as a crunch of leaves, faint, like someone stepping carefully. I thought it was an animal, probably a deer. I turned my head, scanning the edge of the firelight. Nothing, just trees shifting in the wind. I listened harder. After a while, it stopped, and I told myself not to overthink it. Animals lived out here. That was normal. Later that night, as I lay in my tent, I heard it again. This time it was closer. Slow, deliberate steps, one after another. They circled the tent. I froze in my sleeping bag, barely breathing. My hand went straight to the handle of the small knife I kept near me. I didn't unzip the tent, didn't move, just listened. The steps stopped right outside, and then there was this silence that felt heavier than anything I'd ever known. Then, a sound I can't forget. A voice. It wasn't right. It sounded like a person, but it was wrong in a way I can't explain easily. It was too flat, too forced, like someone trying to copy a sound they had only heard once. It muttered something I couldn't make out, and the way it came out made the hair on my arms stand up. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My mind was racing with every possibility. Maybe some crazy person out here messing with me, maybe someone living in the woods, but the way it mimicked a voice didn't feel right. I lay there, knife in hand, until finally the steps moved away. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound, the wind, the creak of branches, the distant calls of night animals, felt sharper, like they were pressing into my ears. When dawn finally broke, I unzipped the tent and looked around. There were tracks in the dirt. Not boots, not deer. Bare feet. Long, narrow, and pressed deep into the soil like whoever it was had stood there for a long time. I tried to convince myself it was just some local wanderer, maybe someone high or drunk. But the size of the prints and the way they circled the camp unsettled me. The third day, I pushed farther out on the trails, but I couldn't shake the feeling I was being followed. Every so often I'd stop and listen, and I swore I heard something just out of sight. A snapped twig, a scuff of dirt, a breath carried on the wind. When I turned around, there was nothing. That night, I built the fire bigger, even though I knew it would burn through my wood faster. I wanted the light. I sat there, staring into the flames, listening to the woods beyond the glow. Hours passed, and then I heard it again. Steps. Slow, steady, circling. My stomach tightened. I gripped the knife, trying to convince myself to yell out, to scare whoever it was away. But I couldn't. I felt if I made a sound, something would break loose. Then I saw it. At the very edge of the firelight, between the trees, something stood. At first I thought it was a man, tall and thin, hunched slightly. But its arms hung too long, and its head was tilted at an angle that didn't look natural. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there watching me. I sat frozen, fire popping in front of me, while it stayed at the tree line. Then it shifted, stepping forward just enough for me to catch the pale skin stretched over it. The way its legs bent wrong at the knees. My chest tightened like I couldn't breathe. Finally, I couldn't take it. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trees. The beam caught only empty trunks swaying in the wind. It was gone. That night was the worst of my life. I didn't sleep. Every crack of wood, every gust of wind, I thought it was right outside. I kept the fire burning, tossing on sticks, watching the flames eat through them just to have light. At one point, I swear I heard my own name whispered outside the tent. The same flat, forced tone as before. When morning came, I didn't even eat. I packed everything as fast as I could, shoving gear into my bag without care. I didn't look around, didn't try to track anything. I just wanted out. My whole hike back, I felt it, that same sense of being watched. Once, I looked back and saw movement through the trees, something slipping behind a trunk, too quick for me to make out clearly. By the time I got to my car, I was drenched in sweat and shaking. I threw my backpack in the back seat and drove until the forest was nothing but a dark line in the rearview mirror. I never went camping alone again after that. To this day, I don't know exactly what I saw. People talk about skinwalkers in those parts, old stories whispered in bars and on back roads. I used to laugh at them. Now I don't. All I know is that I was out there, alone, and something that wasn't right was watching me. Something that moved like a man but wasn't one. That trip taught me something I can't unlearn. Out there, in the silence of the woods, there are things that don't belong, things that don't make sense. And when you realize you're the only one around to see them, the fear doesn't go away. It stays with you. Even now, years later, I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, certain I heard footsteps circling my house. I still remember the summer of 2016 when I drove up to the northern forests of Minnesota to spend a weekend camping by myself. I was 26 back then, and I had been going through a stretch where I just needed to get away from everything. My job, the city noise, the endless routine of work and home. I thought a few quiet days in the woods would clear my head. I had camped plenty of times before, so I didn't think much of the risks. I just packed my small tent, a sleeping bag, a cooler with food, and some basic gear. The drive took about 5 hours, and by the time I turned off onto the dirt roads that led deeper into the forest, the sun had already dropped lower in the sky. The road was rough and narrow, lined with thick trees that leaned over like walls, blocking most of the light. By the time I found a decent spot, a clearing not too far from a lake, it was already close to evening. I hurried to set up camp, staking down the tent, gathering some wood, and getting a fire started. At first, it felt peaceful. The air smelled like pine, the lake was still, and the sound of loons echoed across the water. I ate a simple meal by the fire and tried to enjoy the quiet. But as the night came on, the silence felt different. It wasn't the kind of peaceful silence I expected. It was heavy, almost pressing. The forest around me seemed alive, but not in the comforting way. Every few minutes, I'd hear twigs snapping in the distance or something moving through the brush. I kept telling myself it was just deer or raccoons. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left the fire burning low outside. The ground felt cold beneath the thin layer of my sleeping bag, and I could hear the forest breathing around me. The wind moving through the branches, the occasional splash from the lake, and those scattered sounds of movement. I had camped enough to know forests are never truly quiet, but that night every sound put me on edge. Sometime deep into the night, I woke up to the noise of something moving closer. It wasn't the random, light sound of a small animal. It was heavier, deliberate, like footsteps. My heart started pounding hard in my chest, and I forced myself to stay completely still. The sound circled near my tent, then stopped. For several long seconds, I didn't hear anything at all. I could almost feel the weight of someone or something just outside. I tried to tell myself it was just a curious animal, maybe a bear, but the steps I had heard didn't match that. They had been too careful, too even. I reached slowly toward my backpack where I had a small hatchet tucked inside, just in case. My hand gripped it tight while I lay there in the dark, listening. The sound eventually drifted away, but I couldn't fall back asleep. Every tiny movement outside felt amplified. The thin fabric of the tent suddenly felt like the weakest barrier in the world. Hours seemed to crawl by before the sky finally started to lighten. When I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the first thing I did was scan the ground. Sure enough, there were footprints in the dirt, not more than a few feet from where I had been sleeping. They weren't boot prints from a hiker, and they weren't the padded prints of an animal. They looked like worn shoes, thin-soled, pressed deep into the soft soil. The sight sent a cold chill through me. Someone had been walking around my camp while I slept. I thought about packing up right then and leaving, but I convinced myself maybe it had been another camper passing through. Someone curious, maybe even drunk, who wandered too close. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I spent most of that day fishing on the lake, trying to distract myself. The water was calm, the sun was warm, and for a few hours I managed to feel normal again. But the thought of the footprints stuck with me. I decided I'd only stay one more night and head home early the next morning. As the sun began to set, I built my fire higher than the night before. I wanted as much light as possible. I kept the hatchet close, right beside my chair. I ate dinner slowly, eyes always drifting toward the tree line. The forest felt too quiet again, like it was waiting for something. When darkness came, I sat awake for hours, staring at the fire, forcing myself to stay alert. Eventually my eyes grew heavy, and I thought maybe I had worked myself up over nothing. I put a few more logs on the fire and crawled into the tent, this time leaving the hatchet within reach of my hand. Sometime past midnight, I woke up again. This time, I didn't hear footsteps. I heard the sound of fabric shifting, like something brushing against the side of my tent. My body froze. The faint glow of the fire outside made the thin walls of the tent glow slightly, and I could see the faint outline of a shadow. It wasn't an animal. The shape was tall, human. I gripped the hatchet tighter and forced myself to breathe slowly. The shadow lingered there for what felt like forever, then slowly moved away. I heard soft steps crunching into the dirt, retreating toward the trees. My chest felt like it was going to burst. I didn't move until I was sure the sound was gone. The first light, I packed up everything as fast as I could. My hands were shaking the entire time, and I kept looking over my shoulder. When I finally loaded the last of my gear into the car, I glanced toward the edge of the clearing. That's when I saw it. Pinned to a tree with a long, rusted nail was a piece of fabric. It looked like part of a shirt, torn and faded, hanging limp against the bark. And written across it in thick black marker was one word: "Stay." I stood frozen, staring at it, my stomach twisting. It hadn't been there the day before. Whoever had been circling my tent at night had left it there for me to find. I didn't wait to think about what it meant. I got in my car, started the engine, and drove without stopping until I hit the main road. By the time I reached the highway, I finally started to breathe again. The thought that haunted me wasn't just that someone had been out there watching me. It was that they had been close enough to reach into my tent, close enough to leave a message, and they had chosen not to do anything else, at least not yet. I never went camping alone again after that. The woods no longer felt like a place of peace to me. They felt like a place where someone could watch you, wait for you, and decide what to do with you when no one else was around. Every time I think back to that trip, I still see that piece of fabric nailed to the tree, swaying in the morning breeze, and I know leaving when I did was the only reason I'm still here. had been camping plenty of times before, but the trip I took in the summer of 2014 still sticks with me. I was 27 at the time, living in Colorado, and had a habit of heading out alone whenever I wanted to clear my head. That July, I decided to drive up into the Roosevelt National Forest for a 3-day trip. I packed light, just enough food, water, and gear to keep me comfortable. My plan was simple: hike deep enough off the main trail to avoid other campers, set up near a creek I remembered from a few years back, and just enjoy the quiet. I left early in the morning and parked at a trailhead about 2 hours outside Fort Collins. The first stretch of the hike was easy, sunlight coming through the trees, the air still cool from the night before. By midday, I'd pushed deeper, cutting off onto less marked paths. I always liked the sense of being alone in the woods, the muffled sound of my boots on pine needles, the smell of sap and earth around me. It took me nearly 5 hours to reach the spot I wanted, just a flat area tucked between a line of trees and the edge of a small stream. Setting up camp was routine. I pitched my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, stacked some firewood, and filled my water bottles from the stream after running them through a filter. The afternoon sun was hot, but I kept moving around, cooking a little food, tightening my gear, checking over my map. Nothing felt strange. Nothing gave me a reason to think this trip would be any different than the others. By the time night fell, the forest around me had gone quiet except for the steady rush of water nearby and the occasional snap of a branch from animals moving in the dark. I sat by the fire until it burned low, then crawled into the tent and shut my eyes. The first night was uneventful. I slept deep, waking up once or twice when the air turned cold, but I always drifted back. The next morning, I hiked around without my pack, exploring a ridge about half a mile from camp. The views stretched out far, the peaks layered against each other, blue and hazy in the distance. I ate lunch on a rock outcrop and headed back down. When I returned to camp, I noticed something that caught me off guard. My small hatchet, which I had left stuck in a log near the fire pit, wasn't there. I searched around, thinking maybe I had moved it without remembering, but it was gone. I convinced myself I had left it closer to the stream when I filled the bottles earlier. Sure enough, I found it lying half buried in the mud near the bank. It was strange because I didn't remember setting it down there, but I let it slide. That evening, as the fire cracked, I kept replaying that small detail in my head. I had always been careful with my tools, and leaving something sharp by the water didn't sound like me. I brushed it off as fatigue from the hike, but I couldn't shake the feeling. When night came, I lay in the tent staring at the nylon roof. I didn't fall asleep as easily as before. Sometime past midnight, I woke to the faint crunch of footsteps outside. At first, I told myself it had to be a deer or maybe a raccoon moving around. But these steps were steady, heavier, the way boots sound pressing down on dry leaves. I held my breath, listening. They moved slowly around the camp. A few steps, then silence, then another few steps. I stayed completely still. My flashlight was within reach, but I didn't grab it. After what felt like forever, the sound faded away into the woods. I waited another half hour before my eyes grew heavy again. By the time morning came, I almost convinced myself I had dreamed the whole thing. When I crawled out of the tent, though, I noticed something that made my stomach sink. The fire pit stones had been moved. Not far, just shifted a little, as if someone had kicked them or nudged them with their boot. I knew I hadn't done it. I always kept things neat and steady. It was a small sign, but clear enough. Someone had been there. The second day felt different after that. I kept glancing over my shoulder while hiking, listening for any noise out of place. Every time the wind rustled the trees, my chest tightened. I didn't see anyone, though, and that almost made it worse. The forest felt too quiet, like it was watching me. That evening, I made a decision. Instead of staying a third night like I had planned, I would leave the next morning. I cooked a small meal, packed away most of my gear, and sat with my back to a tree, watching the shadows lengthen. I didn't start a fire this time. The idea of drawing attention made me uneasy. When darkness finally settled, I zipped myself into the tent and lay there, wide awake. The hours crawled by. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it again. Slow footsteps circling the tent. My chest hammered as I tried not to make a sound. Whoever it was stopped just a few feet from where I lay. I could hear their breathing, steady, heavy, human. They lingered there, just standing, for what felt like forever. Finally, the sound faded back into the trees. I didn't sleep after that. I kept my knife gripped tight in my hand, waiting for the first hint of light to creep over the ridge. At dawn, I packed up in minutes, barely stopping to eat. I wanted out of there as fast as possible. My eyes kept scanning the tree line as I hiked back toward the trailhead. For the first couple of miles, nothing seemed wrong. Then I noticed something that froze me. A clear boot print in the mud, fresh from the night before, pointing in the same direction I was walking. I kept going, my pace quickening, ears tuned for any noise behind me. Hours later, when I finally saw the glint of my car through the trees, relief washed over me so hard it made my knees weak. I tossed my gear into the back seat and drove until I hit the highway, not stopping once. Even now, I think about that trip, the hatchet by the stream, the fire pit stones, the footsteps circling in the dark. I know there was someone out there, watching me, waiting for me to fall asleep again. I never found out who it was, and I don't need to. What matters is that I left when I did. If I had stayed that third night, I don't think I would have made it back to the car. I had gone hunting plenty of times before, but this trip was different. It was late October of 2013, in the thick woods of northern Montana, not far from the Canadian border. I was 28 at the time, and I had planned this trip for weeks. I had some time off work and wanted to get out into the quiet, away from my phone and the noise of town. I packed everything carefully: my rifle, ammo, tent, sleeping bag, small stove, and enough food to last me 3 days. My plan was simple: set up camp in a spot near the ridge, hike during the day to track deer, and return to camp by evening. The air was already sharp with cold when I parked my truck at the dirt pull-off and started walking in. I had picked a spot about 3 miles into the forest, far enough to be away from any other hunters, but close enough that I could make it back if the weather turned bad. The hike in was calm. The leaves on the ground were dry, and every step cracked under my boots. The air smelled of pine and wet earth. A stream cut through the woods on the way, and I figured that was a good sign. Animals always come to water. By the time I reached the clearing I had marked on my map, the sun was already lowering, burning orange through the trees. I set my tent up just inside the tree line, giving myself cover but still with a view of the clearing ahead. I laid out my sleeping bag, unrolled my mat, and organized everything neatly so I could grab what I needed without fumbling in the dark. After cooking a quick meal of beans and jerky on the small stove, I sat quietly as the woods went dark. The sounds of crickets filled the air, and far off I could hear the call of something larger, maybe an elk. The first night passed without trouble. It was cold, and I woke up a few times shivering, but nothing out of the ordinary. The second day I was up before dawn. I loaded my rifle, threw a thermos of coffee into my pack, and set out along a game trail that led deeper into the trees. The ground was damp and I found fresh prints, deer tracks, big ones. I followed them for hours, crouching now and then to check the direction. By noon I had gone farther than I had expected, and the silence of the woods started to feel heavy. I hadn't seen a single person, not even heard distant gunfire from other hunters, just the wind and the occasional crack of a branch. I stopped by the stream again to drink, filling my bottle with filtered water. When I stood back up, I noticed something across the stream. At first I thought it was just broken branches, but then I saw the shape. A piece of bright fabric, half hidden under the brush. I crossed over carefully, my boots sinking into the soft mud. When I got closer, I realized it was a torn jacket. Faded red, dirty, stiff like it had been there for a while. I felt uneasy right away. There were no footprints around it, no gear, nothing else. Just that jacket, ripped in the back like it had been caught on something or maybe cut. I left it there, but it stayed in my mind the rest of the day. I hunted, but I couldn't focus. Every sound felt sharper, every shadow seemed heavier. By the time I made it back to camp, the sky was already gray with evening, and I felt drained. I cooked again, this time barely tasting the food. That night, lying in the tent, I kept thinking about that jacket. Who did it belong to? Why was it just left there? Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint at first, like branches moving, but it was steady. Footsteps, slow, crunching footsteps circling my camp. My heart started pounding. I reached for my rifle, keeping it close against my chest. I didn't move, barely breathed, just listened. The steps came closer, then stopped. I stared at the thin fabric of the tent, straining to see a shadow. Nothing, just silence. After what felt like forever, I heard the steps again, moving away this time, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep again that night. At first light, I crawled out of the tent, scanning around. There were fresh boot prints in the dirt, not mine. Larger, heavier, heading from the tree line toward my tent and back again. They circled once, then disappeared into the woods in the direction of the stream. I wanted to pack up and leave right then, but part of me told myself it could have been another hunter. Maybe he was lost, maybe curious. Still, the way those steps circled me in the dark made my stomach turn. I forced myself to stay. I had planned 3 days, and I wasn't gonna run just because of some stranger. That day, I didn't hunt much. I stayed near camp, checking my gear, making sure my rifle was always within arm's reach. I gathered extra wood and built the fire larger than usual, the smoke rising high above the trees. I thought maybe the sight of it would keep anyone from coming too close. The hours dragged. My nerves were on edge with every little sound. As night came again, the cold seemed sharper, the woods quieter. I kept the fire burning bright and sat awake, watching. Around midnight, I heard it again, the crunch of boots on dry leaves. This time closer, more deliberate. My throat went dry. I could feel the hairs on my arms standing. I held the rifle tight and stared into the dark beyond the firelight. I didn't see anyone, just the flicker of the flames on the trees. The steps moved again, circling, stopping, starting. Whoever it was, they were careful, staying just out of sight. I didn't shout, didn't move. I just sat frozen, waiting. After a long while, the sound faded, but I didn't relax. At dawn, I finally made my choice. I packed everything quickly, shoving gear into my bag without care. I wasn't going to stay another night. When I stepped out of the clearing and back onto the trail, I glanced down and saw fresh prints again. The same boots pressed deep into the mud. They had come closer during the night, right up to where I had sat by the fire. The hike back to my truck felt endless. I kept turning my head, certain I was being followed, but the trees gave nothing away. When I finally reached the road, the sight of my truck sitting there in the gray morning light nearly made me collapse with relief. I threw my pack into the back and didn't stop until I was miles away. Later, when I thought about it, the details gnawed at me. That torn jacket by the stream, the footprints that circled me, never once approaching in daylight, only in the dark. Whoever it was, they had no interest in hunting. They had an interest in me. The thought of them standing out there in the shadows, watching me while I tried to sleep, was worse than anything I could have imagined. I never went back to that part of Montana. Even now, years later, every time I step into the woods, I feel that same chill on my spine, the memory of footsteps in the dark that weren't mine.